Well, good afternoon, everyone. I think I'll go ahead and get started. There may be some people still dribbling in with the weather knows, but if you come in and know you're online, hopefully you can hear everything on the Zoom presentation. This will be the first one that I've gotten to work. So, before I get into today's speaker, I just want to, next week we'll be having a speaker, Len Mankowski, he's a graduate of Michigan Test GMES department. I don't have a title yet from him, but I think they'll be talking about some work he's done with PFAS remediation projects, groundwater remediation projects. So it's be a timely station and information is coming out on that sometime soon. Today's speaker, Professor Rod Chimner, I've known for quite a long time, but most of my time has been spent freezing at cross-country skiing events while our kids have been skiing. And so I'm happy to have a chance today to hear some of the serious work he's doing. Is well known in wetlands ecology research. I won't give a long introduction, but Freeze Michigan State and Colorado State and time as a postdoc in Hawaii. And well known for his work on peatland ecology and climate change effects, which will be, I think, the focus of today's presentation. So I look forward to that. And we'll get to see some topical locations as well. That'll be
just like that.
A nice
Yeah.
Contrast to today's environment. So
Great, thanks. And the theme of the talk is World Wetlands Day, because this Thursday is World Wetland Day, and I'm actually a keynote speaker at University of Calgary, or not in Calgary. So when Eric said, "Would you want to give a talk?" I was like, "Yes." So this would be a great time for me to practice that one, and it's actually on World Wetland Day, which I always thought was unfortunate that it's in February for us, because I guess the best we can do is show pictures of wetlands. But the theme of World Wetlands Day this year is time for restoration. And so that ties in nicely with, I don't know if everyone knows, but we're in the second year of the UN decade of ecosystem restoration. So there's a huge focus globally on wetland restoration and peatland restoration and all sorts of restoration, but especially wetlands. So just a massive push. So why do we restore wetlands? Why is it such a focus right now? Well, lots of different reasons. Wetlands are known to improve water quality through various mechanisms. And we often build wetlands and restore them to put next to farm fields, things like that to improve water quality. They're also restored and they have important benefits for coastal erosion. So that they help out with that. Sediment deposition, so they basically can absorb, well not absorb, but sequester sediments that are running off hill slopes that they get caught in the wetlands. And biodiversity, habitat, those are all important. But lately, one of the most important ones that we're dealing with is carbon storage. And because wetlands are now actually part of this natural climate solution. So I wanted to make sure I knew exactly what that was. So I asked the chatbot before I got flooded. Now I can't use it. And that thing's really smart. And this is what I summarized what it said, is natural climate solutions are a suite of strategies that aim to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and sequester carbon by protecting, restoring, or enhancing natural systems. And what I didn't put in there is it said wetlands and peatlands many times. So even the chat box said restoring wetlands is a smart thing to do. So if the AI says it, who am I to argue, right? So I was pretty pleased with that. And so why would it think that? Well, it's because wetlands store a lot of carbon, a lot of carbon. So this is a picture of a wetland, a peatland in Colorado, and it actually sloughed off like a calving glacier. So you can actually see this nice profile. This is like 4 feet of peat. And peat is just partially decomposed organic matter, which is 50% carbon. So this thing is just this wetland is just nothing but a big vat of carbon storage. And there's tens of this one's probably 8,000 years old. So they store this carbon for thousands of years. And over time, they just build up this massive carbon pool on our planet. And we have so much carbon that we have to give them colored names because you get confused. So one of the colors that we talk about is blue carbon. And that is the amount of carbon stored in coastal systems in wetlands. So this is a nice diagram that I stole from the Nature Conservancy talking about blue carbon. And so they identify it as coastal wetlands like coastal marshes, tidal marshes, mangroves, this is a picture of a mangrove in Micronesia that I used to walk through for my work. And then also seagrass beds, which I don't work in seagrass beds, but I'd love to do that. Sounds really fun. But so if you look at their data, so basically every year this blue carbon or coastal wetlands sequester enough CO2 to offset 1 billion barrels of oil per year. So that's a huge number. Or 1 hectare of mangroves can offset the emissions of 726 tons of coal. So we're talking big numbers of carbon that these wetlands deal with. But unfortunately, it goes the other way around too. So if you can store a lot, you can lose a lot. And a great example of this that I really like, that I use in my class, is shrimp farming in these blue coastal or these coastal environments and mangroves. So what they do is they go in and they build ponds in existing mangroves, and then they flood them and they grow shrimp for selling to restaurants and stuff globally. That's where most of your shrimp comes from now. But that's been a huge impact on mangroves. You've lost about 25% of all the mangrove loss has been to this aquaculture. And so here's a great image from Honduras, this big coastal wetland. And you look at what it was, these are old photos, but it's still going on around the world. So this is what it used to look like. And then 10 years later, you can see all of this aquaculture has come in. So that's just a lot. So the question that scientists looked at was, how much carbon is that? So there was this, I find this really cool study done. And what they did is they calculated how much carbon was lost by building these ponds, shrimp ponds. Then they calculated how long those shrimp ponds last before they fail, and then how much shrimp they produce. And then they just converted that into greenhouse gas emissions. And what they found was that a typical dinner emits the same amount of CO2 equivalent as you driving your car across the United States. So every time you eat a shrimp dinner from a shrimp pond, you're driving across the US. So I just find that pretty amazing. Even if they're off in order of magnitude, I'm still impressed. That's a huge number. So that just kind of puts it in perspective of how much carbon we're dealing with these wetlands. It's a lot. So there's different types of wetlands out there. So we tend to break them up into 2 different types. We have mineral soil wetlands like marshes that have a little bit of organic, that black organic soil on top of like sand, silt, and clay. Or we have peatlands that, like that picture I showed, was really deep organic layers. And so we had this second state of the carbon cycle report where we calculated how much carbon is in North American wetlands, all of them. So this is a DOE project, US Global Climate Change Program. And what we found is that peatlands in North America, so all of North America, peatlands stored 80% of the wetland carbon, and these mineral soil wetlands only stored 20%. But this number, as you saw with those mangroves, is still a lot of carbon, but peatlands store even more. So they're just a huge storehouse of carbon. So because of that, there's been a really big focus on restoring peatlands for a natural climate solution. And so we just finished a global peatland assessment. So the UN set up this program, part of the Global Peatlands Initiative. So each continent region had a whole team of scientists looking at the state of peatlands for that area. So I was one of the lead authors with Lynn Roper and Marie Strack, peatland scientists from Canada. So we were in charge of North America. So we looked at all the peatlands in North America and what kind of their status. But other groups did South America, Europe, Asia, that Pacific region. And so what did we find? Well, we found there's a lot of peatlands in the world. Most of them are in the boreal region. So about 57% of the peatlands, which you can see the peatlands on this map are these kind of reddish colored peatlands. So most of them are in the boreal region, all the way across. So Siberia, Canada, Scandinavia, this area, Alaska, but there's also boreal peat down in Chile as well. Doesn't really show up well. 10% above that in the Arctic zone, and then about 12% in the temperate zone, where we're at now, and then 20% is in the tropics. So there's a lot of peatland in the tropics. And just for showing you, I'm going to be talking about peatlands in Borneo here in a little bit, just so you can put that as a reference on the global map. So lots of peat out there. Peatlands occupy about 4% of the entire US globe of land surface. So 4% of the land is peatlands. But a lot of these peatlands are under impact. They're being disturbed by many different things, and the pace is picking up of how they're being disturbed. So they made a map showing where these high impact peatlands were. So Europe is known for having impacted their wetlands and peatlands for hundreds of years, right? If you've ever been to Europe, you'll see that. So that's one of the big areas. The next biggest area, or the largest area, is Indonesia, which I'll talk about. So Indonesia has a lot of impacts to their peatlands. And then right where we're at, the Great Lakes region, we have a lot of impact to our peatlands. So this is high intensity impacts. And this map is low impact, which seems to be just like everything else that has some sort of minimal impact around the world. And so this actually affects our climate change emissions from each country. And so this map shows how much carbon is being released from these degraded peatlands back into the atmosphere. And Indonesia has the largest. You can see here that's releasing a lot of carbon into the atmosphere. It's huge. And we'll talk about that. But other countries, Russia, China, you know, all the countries with a lot of peatlands. And for once, we're not #1 greenhouse gas emitter in something. So I was pretty pleased. Or I guess we can work on that. We can still get there. But there's a lot of countries that emit a lot of carbon dioxide from land use change on wetlands. So what's causing the impacts? Well, we looked at what we could find in North America, and agriculture is the #1 issue impacting all wetlands and peatlands in North America. That's why there was such a big blob in our area, because a lot of the agricultural lands in the Midwest used to be wetlands. That's why the soil's so black. So they're often drained or have tile drains, and then they grow crops. But while they're growing crops, you're releasing all that carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. So you're losing carbon while you're farming. Development is now a big pressure in a lot of areas. They're now building cities and subdivisions and wetlands. So that's a big loss. Where agriculture has been mostly in the past, where we've lost most of them, you know, like the first 200 years since we settled this area. And now, and another impact is pasture. So a lot of wetlands are drained and then allow cattle and sheep and other things on there. Mining is a big impact, especially in Canada. The tar sands are a big problem. Reservoirs are on top of them. Forestry can be an impact. Roads can be a large impact, right? Roads cut through wetlands all the time. That degrades them. So there's a lot of different impacts. And a lot of these are similar around the world. It's the same sort of ones, just different places. So just summary of what the global peat assessment found is that peatlands occupy 4% of the land surface, store 550 gigatons, which is a lot, one of the largest sinks of carbon on the planet, which is 1/3 of all soil carbon. So you think of all the forest and grasslands and everything else, peatlands store 1/3 of all the world's carbon, so soil carbon. So it's massive, which is larger than all the other vegetation types. But unfortunately, these degraded peatlands contribute greater than 4% of all the anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. So the global peat assessment estimated that we're releasing 1,900 megatons of CO2 per year annually, not counting fires, right? Peat fires release a lot of carbon, but they're too episodic, so they didn't include that in this number, but that's another almost as much as their estimate. And to put that in perspective, global aviation emits, you know, a little under 1,000 megatons per year. So degraded peatlands release more carbon to the atmosphere than all our airplanes combined. So it's a big number. No, and that's not even counting all these other wetland types that aren't peatlands. So degraded wetlands clearly are impacting our strongly. So what are our options? What do we do about this? Well, the first option is one, we conserve what we got. That's the best option because they are such dense storehouses of carbon that if you just leave them alone, they keep the carbon in the soil. Is when they're degraded that it becomes a problem. So one, protect what we can. Two, we got to restore what's degraded. Like this site is in Colorado, so I'm going to be restoring this wetland this summer. This peatlands have been bare for 50 years. It's been releasing carbon nonstop. So the other option is we can fix these up and have it start sequestering carbon again. So those are our two main options, preserve or restore. So good example of some restoration projects and carbon is in the peatland, tropical peatland world. So, you know, we used to think that all peatlands were in these cold regions because there was a lot of northern people working in Europe and stuff who came across peatlands. So we thought peatlands had to be cold to exist, but it turns out that's completely wrong because the last 20, 30 years, we've come to realize that the tropics have a tremendous number of peatlands and they're really deep and amazing. So, but what's really cool about these Indonesia or tropical peatlands, a lot of them are forested. So a lot of ours have sedges and mosses and a few trees. In the tropics, you don't have that. They're these really cool tropical rainforests, basically. And they're so wet that they just form peat and really deep. They can be mass, you know, tens of meters thick. So Indonesia, this is a picture from Micronesia again, you know, really big wetland swamps. So that's what you find in Indonesia. There's also tropical peatlands, sorry, in the Amazon that are actually pretty new to science, only a few years that we've known about them. And then also, probably in the last 10 years, we've learned how many peatlands are in the Amazon basin. And a lot of the peatlands in the Amazon are actually made from palm trees. So they do have trees, but a lot of them are palm. So they're not all the same. And the biodiversity in Indonesian peatlands are tremendous. They have more tree species in 10 acres than we have on our whole continent. So I don't even try to figure out what trees they are because beyond my ability to key out trees. So the diversity of plants is incredibly high. The biodiversity of animals is just as high. I mean, it's pretty amazing to see these when you work with these people and they show you their wildlife cameras. I'm used to seeing a deer or a bear. But they're like seeing Sumatran tigers and rhinos and elephants all in their wetlands. So it's pretty amazing. And plus the orangutan, which is really famous in these wetlands. But unfortunately, these populations are all plummeting. And the reason they're plummeting in these areas is one is due to illegal logging or legal logging. They remove a lot of timber and that causes changes. Doing a lot of agriculture, so like everywhere else, they drain their peatlands and try to grow non-wetland crops on there, like pineapples and other things that don't like it being too wet. And of course, the big one is palm oil. So most tropical peatlands in Indonesia, a lot of them have been cut over, drained, turned into palm oil. So this is a picture showing an Indonesian peatland. You can see it's been ditched to make it drier. They plant these palm trees. The palm trees grow up, they harvest the fruit, those fruit get squeezed and they make palm oil. And that palm oil goes into everything we eat, everything we use, even biodiesel, it's everywhere now. So palm oil is a huge problem to the biodiversity and issues here. So once you drain these tropical peatlands, a couple things happen. One, you drain it, you let oxygen into that peat, and it decomposes and that CO2 goes into the atmosphere. The other thing that happens is the peat subsides. So here is a picture that some scientists took in Indonesia. The peat surface in 1979 was up here. In 2007, so like 20 years later, it's peat soils down here. So they've lost, and this guy's 2 meters tall. So they've lost 6, 7 feet of peat. Half of that's probably been compressed due to compaction and the other half's been lost due to decomposition, so it's in the atmosphere. So picture that over all of this region of Indonesia. So it's a lot lost. The other thing that happens when you drain peat, since it's mostly carbon, and carbon likes to burn. So peat fires are a rampant problem in Indonesia. So a lot of farmers, to clear their fields, they light fires to clear the way the vegetation, and then it just escapes. So it's not because of lightning. There's no lightning strikes are pretty rare there. It's all human induced. And then that's an additional massive amount of carbon being lost from each fire. So these peat fires can be so catastrophic that, and they're worse in El Nino because that's their driest climate period is El Nino. So one of their biggest fires started occurring in 1997, 1998. And it released, they estimate, almost 60% of all the fossil of all the CO2 emissions from humans on here. So 60% came from this peat fire versus all the cars and factories and airplanes and everything. So it's just mind-boggling. Plus, it's a human health hazard. So the last big fires was 2019, and over 100,000 people died due to toxic peat smoke. So you don't want to mess around with peat smoke. It's not good. So because of all of these problems, the Indonesian government created this Indonesian Peatland and Mangrove Restoration Agency. So their sole goal is try to restore tropical peatlands and mangroves on their lands. And it's a political entity. There's a lot of issues with it, but their goal is to restore up to 3 million acres of peatlands and 1.5 million acres of mangroves in Indonesia. So one of the projects that I got involved with, I was lucky enough to be a consultant and then run some workshops there, was this Cadogan Peatland Restoration Project, which is really cool. And it was all about preserving and restoring peatlands for selling carbon credits. It was really a unique way of thinking about this. I'll try to walk you through and see if it makes sense. But so this is the island of Borneo, and it's broken into two. So this lower part is Indonesian. This top part up here is Malaysian. So this lower part is called Kalimantan. And so this whole region down here is where most of the peatlands are, and Borneo. And so this is kind of a Google Earth image. So this right here is a big national park that's almost all tropical peatland. This big green area, which again has a bunch of ditches in it and stuff. So they're doing a lot of restoration work as well. But this project is called the Cadogan Project, and it's right next to it. So it's a really great location because then you have that location next to a national park for all the animals and birds to go back and forth. So that's great. And for any of you familiar with Indonesia, the Mega Rice Project is just on the right of this park, which was a boondoggle project where they drained all these peatlands to try to produce rice, and it failed in the 90s. So you got that over there, the national park here, and then the Cadogan project here. And so you can go online and you can buy carbon credits, which I thought about doing, but it seemed like a lot of effort to get in to do that. And so the way they're doing that, or I should say, and is actually working. In 2019, they sold credits to Shell and to Volkswagen for carbon credits. So what they're doing is they're selling credits of carbon that have not been released to the atmosphere. So what they're saying is if they hadn't preserved this site, it would have been taken over by palm oil and all that carbon would have went into the air. But since they're preserving it, they are capturing that carbon that hasn't been emitted yet. It took me forever to figure that out when I was there. So that's what they're doing. They're selling carbon credits by preservation. But they're also doing a lot of restoration because you can't keep that area intact without fixing some of it, because they have canals and ditches on the site. They're dealing with rampant fire. So they hire a lot of local community people and they're out fighting fires. They're trying to stop people from lighting fires. There's a whole community effort to try to keep these fires at bay. Plus they're doing techniques. I'll show you of how they're blocking these canals to try to re-wet the area, and then the smaller ditches that they use. So those are all being restored, and then they're trying to monitor that carbon with science. So here's a picture of the site. This is the canal part. So just picture, 20, 30 years ago, this was all tropical, forest all the way across here. So they put in this big canal to drain the site, and then there's side ditches coming down that you can't really see to further drain it. So this dried peat is losing carbon due to oxygen in their decomposition, and these fires are just ripping through here, burning anything that tries to regenerate. So it's the double problem of drying and fires causing this issue. So if you look at the soil, it's just burnt over peat, just charred to nothing, with nothing able to grow but ferns and other annual plants. So they, like I said, have been working hard to try to stop those fires, and they've had some success. These are like photos from 2014, and then that's when they started their fire protection. And you can see now by 2018, which is the latest photos I could get from them, they were pretty proud that they're getting all these trees growing back, and they're tropical trees, so they can grow pretty fast. would take us 100 years. It can take them just a few years to get these trees growing back. So they are having some success. They're also working on damming and fixing these ditches so they don't drain the area so much. So this is actually in Sumbangu National Park. This canal is being restored. And so that's what that's doing is re-wetting the peat and plants next to it. Because the water backs up behind here and gets higher. And they have an opening in the middle because these canals are now how people, they're like the way we use highways. So they have these really narrow boats and they zip up and down these canals. And it's really hard to get rid of the canals now. So they're trying to figure out ways that they can restore them, but yet still allow people to use them as transportation corridors. So the little boats would just come right through these openings. So they could get it wetter if they didn't have those, but then the people tear them down because they're mad. They can't ride their boat through there. So they're working really hard coming up with some unique solutions like little side ramps of water going around it and all sorts of things. So that's what's going on in Indonesia. There's hundreds of projects going on. That's just one of them that kind of give you an example of what's going on there. But restoration is not one thing anymore. It used to be, we're going to put this system back to the way it used to be in the past. But we don't think of restoration that way anymore. More reinstating the ecological processes and making it better. And it works along this whole gradient from fully recovering to native exactly the way it was to everything just down to like reducing impacts, things like that. So this wide gradient of restoration. So one of the projects that I'm on is we're looking at, can we restore some of these shallower tropical peatlands in Indonesia, but not put them back to native species that probably would have been there, but can we use native species that people can make a livelihood from? So can we get agroforestry going on the edges so the people have livelihoods, because now there's thousands and thousands of people living in these peatland areas and they need something. If they don't have livelihoods, they do illegal logging and poaching and all these other things. So now we're trying to say, all right, can we restore it, but give people a livelihood instead of putting it back to the way it was? So it's just a different way of thinking about restoration. And so did these studies to figuring out what trees work best in these situations, but we do want to restore it some. We don't want to keep it dry. We want to re-wet it so it's better, but you just plant different species there. So did a lot of greenhouse trials on what plants and what trees work best and what gives them a better financial return. Does it make sense? There's a market for it. So all this economic stuff going on. So that I find that really interesting because otherwise we may not get to restore these at all because people still need to live there. And this is called, this kind of new growing thing is called pluticulture. So pluticulture, so agriculture in wetlands means you drain them, you ditch them, you dry them out, and then you grow crops on it that aren't wetland species. But eventually all that organic soil goes away. It's just a matter of time. But in this way, this pluticulture, you keep the soils wet, you keep the carbon in the soil, and you grow species that are wetland adapted. So that way you can keep your carbon, keep your ecosystems, but you still get a product. So I first worked on this in Micronesia where the Micronesians were growing taro, wetland taro in these peatlands, and they didn't have to drain anything. So they would just open a little hole in the forest, grow taro, harvest it, and then eventually after a few times, they would just let it go back through succession, back to forest. So that's really great. And so an example in Indonesia is you can drain the peat and you can grow rubber trees from the Amazon, because the Amazon rubber trees produce more rubber, but they don't grow in wetlands. Or they have their own native rubber trees that they could grow in these pluticulture systems and get rubber from. So there's a big push to do this more in wetlands globally. Let's stop draining them, let's keep them wet, but then if you want another product on top of that, you can. And another example of that is what we do in forestry. So there's a lot of arid peatlands and wetlands around the world where they drain the peat and then the trees grow faster, or we plant different trees there. So in Indonesia, they will drain the peat and they'll put in eucalyptus or other species that are not wetland adapted species. But if you did pluticulture, you wouldn't have to do that. You could actually grow wetland trees That'd be great. And a lot of areas now are trying to get rid of all those trees as part of their restoration. So Scotland did a massive amount of tree removal because the government decided it was a good idea to drain peatlands, put trees there for people's livelihoods. But that's caused all sorts of problems. So now Scotland's trying to get rid of all their trees on these peatlands and restore them all. So I guess it is job creation. And we have a similar polluted culture around here. So we don't drain our peatlands for forestry, right? We have black spruce and tamarack and northern white cedar and all these trees that we use, and we don't drain them. So that is a type of polluted culture. If we were to drain them and plant white pine, right, that'd cause all sorts of problems. So we've been doing a lot of work on northern white cedar, which is a really important tree in this region. And so we've mapped all the peat and found out that not only is it a cool tree, but most of them are peatlands, and they probably store more carbon in Michigan than any other ecosystem type. I don't have the data completely yet. It's still a back of the envelope calculation, but it's a lot of carbon. So hopefully I'll have that number soon. But we also do silviculture on these forests to try to get forest products. And what we found is that after harvesting the cedar, only 18% of them go back to cedar. If anyone knows anything about cedar, you're not too surprised. We don't have great success growing cedar. Instead, when we cut them, they go to these alternative forest types. So either tag alder or balsam fir or red maple. And so even though those are native trees, I think what's happening is, our program is, I'll get to that point, is can we do better job cutting trees so we can actually increase this number, so when we harvest cedar, it goes back to a cedar swamp? Or can we do restoration on these lower ones and get them back to cedar? So we're working a lot on that. And the reason I think that's important is, one, is habitat. And two, like I said, these things store a lot of carbon, and I think a lot of that carbon is due to the tree itself. Northern white cedar is actually related to redwood trees, and so is rot resistant, which is why we like it. And it forms this really woody peat, which is actually very similar to what the peat looks like in Indonesia with all those trees. Where tag alder and balsam fir and stuff, they don't really form peat. Their wood breaks down quickly. So I've never seen a balsam fir peat. Anyone? I haven't seen them. Tag alder. So I think it's really changing our carbon cycling as well. And we have a lot of hydrologic alterations to these tropical swamps. So just like they do in Indonesia, but instead of having drain or instead of ditches and all that stuff, we have roads. So there's a lot of roads around here and wherever cedar is at. And so this shows right along US 2 in Engadine. The groundwater is coming this way. There's no cross drainage in this road. The water backs up, killing all the cedar on this side, turning it into a marsh, which is, I'm sure, emitting a lot of methane because it's really wet with cattails. And on the other side is really dry. So you're probably losing a lot of CO2 because the peat's dried out. So what we're doing is like, how can we fix that? So we tried testing out a couple of different methods of this porous road bed. So what we want is the water to just flow right through it. So what we did is we found a couple areas in Minnesota. We tore out the old road that wasn't working very well, put down geotextiles, put down this layer of rock, put more geotextile and put more the road bed then on top. And so now what happens is the water comes this way, instead of backing up behind here or going through a culvert that comes shooting out and eroding the peatland on the other side, which doesn't work because it doesn't go back into the groundwater. But now the water just flows under the ground and comes out on this side. So the groundwater stays groundwater all the way under the road. So this has been working pretty well so far. So we've done a lot of work on mountain peatland restoration. So what I didn't show you before is you see all this orange stuff, and that's all lowland peatlands. But if you look, we have peatlands all over the mountains, but they're too small to be mapped at this global scale. So people really didn't even know they existed. But we've done a lot of work on these mountain peatlands, and there's thousands and thousands, probably millions of them just in one mountain range. So we did a mapping at just one part of Colorado, And we identified over 6,000 of these wetlands in the mountains. So they were everywhere. No one had any idea there were that many. And then we did a survey. We went to a lot of them and assessed, are they in good condition? Are they poor condition? Are they degraded? And we found that about 10% of them needed restoration from overgrazing or mining or roads or something. So given our sample design, that means I estimate there's at least 600 peatlands there that probably need restoration. And I think I say I've done like 6, 7, so I got a lot to go. And that's just one little area in Colorado. So, and we've also been working now in the Andes a lot with our team. And so we're mapping peatlands all through Colombia and Ecuador, and been working, got some preliminary data and Peru on these mappings. And what we're finding is that there are so many, even more wetlands in the Andes, especially these tropical Andes, because it rains a lot. And so in Ecuador, where we mapped, 18% of the landscape was peatlands. And in Peru, where it's drier, there was still 6%, where in Colorado it was like 1%. So there's just, you go to those mountains, there's just wetlands everywhere. And not only are there a lot of them, they're really deep. So this is me coring one of these peatlands in Colombia, and it was 38 feet deep of peat. So that's a lot of carbon. So you extrapolate that out across the Andes, and there's a lot of carbon these mountain peatlands are storing that we have zero idea how many there are at a global scale. We didn't even map them in the global peatland assessment that just came out. So and they're around in every mountain range, the Himalayas, Alps, Rockies, they're all full of wetlands. But they're degraded by a lot of things too, especially grazing. Most wetlands, mountain wetlands globally are overgrazed, or they're mined, or there's drained for agriculture like potatoes or other crops, or hydroelectric dams. So all of those degrade these mountain peatlands. So we've been developing methods like how do we restore these systems? And restoring mountain wetlands is a lot more difficult than these flat peatlands because they're on a slope and they erode easily. And so you get a lot of gullies like this site in Colorado, it's eroded and formed a gully due to overgrazing by sheep probably 100 years ago. It doesn't take much to start the erosion process. So almost all of these things are ditched because if you want cattle or sheep, you got to ditch it and things like that. So we've done a lot of work on ditch restoration. So this site in Colorado, we stored this ditch, this wetland, and so we developed a technique where we bury these Excelsior bales, we fill it up with peat, and then we plant it, and then after a few years, that ditch is gone, and the groundwater is now just flowing right across the site. We wet this whole area. So this is looking down. So with these mountain wetlands, it only takes one ditch to dewater almost the entire wetland. This picture, here's a slope. The wetland is right here. So the groundwater is coming down the slope. So if you have a ditch up here, this water hits that ditch and just flows off the site. So it dries out this whole area. So we were able to show that we wetted that whole area just by filling in that top ditch. So it's super useful. We've also restored whole wetlands. So this is a wetland in Colorado that in the 1970s, someone took a bulldozer to it and they put in ditches and they scraped the soil. They were trying to get minerals out of it. So then when we found it again in the 2000s, it was this whole thing was eroded. So this top part was the bulldozer part, and then this whole slope eroded. You can see how steep this is. Everyone pictures wetlands as flat, but a lot of these, this is like a 20-degree slope. I get tired. You kind of want to like get handholds climbing up it. It's kind of weird, but it makes it really difficult to restore. So we worked with all sorts of people and volunteers and students, and we restored this site. So in 2012 is when the restoration occurred. So we filled in these ditches across here. We profiled everything and planted everything. And here's what it looks like last summer. So that looks really great. I was pretty happy with that. Here's one of these ditches that's draining the whole wetland. We filled it in. And now you would never know that ditch was there unless I pointed it out to you on site. So everything's working really well. Here's that really steep section that I stressed about how we were going to do that one. We didn't have as good luck on that one. This is after like 8 years, and you can see it's still really bare. We got a lot more plants, and we did stop the erosion, but it just didn't get as wet. And we had a couple years of massive drought in this region, and the plants didn't do well. 2 years ago, it caught fire somehow. I don't even know how wetland catches fire, but there wasn't even lightning that day. So now we're back to square one, and summer we'll be working on that sloping part, but everything else is great with it. Here's a picture of Ecuador. Again, like all this, a lot of what you see is peatland. And they have just as much problems with ditching and everything else. So here's this peatland that was, heavily ditched. I won't get into why. So I had a workshop and I showed them how to build these ditch plugs and how to restore these systems, and they took it and ran with it and they restored the whole thing. So now all these ditches are filled in with nice plants and it's looking great. So thank you for that. We restored wetlands in Peru, and the reason I'm showing you these because South America has very little history of restoration, especially wetlands. So these are a lot of the first projects that have been done in these countries for this. So it's been trying to just build the support network for getting these projects going. So just like everywhere else, Peatland and Huascarán National Park in Peru, which is a beautiful national park, amazing wetlands and peatlands. But again, a lot of them are ditched and drained this was for the road that they built, but a lot of them are ditched for pastures and other reasons. And so we worked with local communities and I developed a restoration plan and we restored the site by building these ditch plugs. And you can see the water is now re-wetting the site and everything's looking pretty good. So the question is that useful? Is that just fun for me, or is it actually making a climate difference? And that's the question that people have been trying to figure out now. Is it a natural climate solution? So let's look at some of our data that I just showed you, or the sites that I showed you. So this is Rocky Mountain National Park. This is the biggest peatland in the park. And there was a ditch running right down the middle. My advisor helped the National Park Service to restore it in the late 80s, early 90s. So we went back and studied it. This is what it looks like today, or I think last year. That ditch is gone. They did work immediately to show that it used to be dry, but once they restored it, this gray area shows wetter areas, and it actually re-wet the whole wetland. So even that little ditch has a huge impact because it's on a slope, so it can move a lot of water. And then we did carbon flux data there. And this is that ecosystem exchange. Just think about is carbon storage measured with the machine in this middle of the day. So the higher the number, the more carbon it's storing. So this restored site is restoring a lot more carbon dioxide than the degraded site, and even more than the reference sites. So this was a combination of 5 of these restoration projects that are all similar to the one I just showed you there. So it's storing more carbon. So that's great. It's not losing it anymore. It's storing more of it. But what I found really exciting is that 2 years ago, Colorado had one of the largest fires in its history, and it blew right through there. So I just panicked because that's where I did my PhD work, and I just love that wetland. And it just burned to a crisp. The forest was just gone. I mean, these trees are just, you can't even see, there's no soil left in the forest. And it just burned right over that wetland that I just showed you. Here's PVC pipe is just melted over on the ground. So it was a hot fire, it burned right through. I'm like, what's gonna happen? And we know that drained peat burns deeper than not drained peat. So it could have burned really deep, killed all the plants, because right, those plants have live roots underground. Next spring, that wetland looked as green as ever, probably greener than normal. So to me, this was super exciting because that re-wetted peatland stayed wet, even though it was in a drought period. And they just kept the burn to just a surface burn, which wetlands burn all the time. They're used to that. It's just a really deep peat burns that we don't like. So I would say restoration saved that wetland from what it versus if we hadn't restored it in the past. So I thought that was really nice to see. So we took flux measurements at that Peru site just to see what would happen with our graduate student. So she measured a bunch of data. So this again, it just shows, I don't worry about the units, but the bigger the number, the more carbon it's storing. So these blue dots are our reference sites. So they were areas that were not degraded or not greatly degraded, probably low intensity. These red areas were really degraded spots that we left degraded because we didn't restore those areas. And these yellow were degraded before the restoration and they moved to these pink ones after restoration. So this is before and after restoration. And you can see that all these sites down here have lower carbon storage than they do after we restored it. But one of the big criticisms of peatland and wetland restoration is that it can release more methane because it's wetter, and methane is a more potent greenhouse gas. So we measured methane, and it was great because we restored, the site stored more CO2, but it did not emit more methane. Methane did not go up at all. So in this particular site. So that was good news. But we can look at this more at an experimental design. So working with the Forest Service and Evan Kane, we've had this long running project of this peat chasm up in the parking lot, where we took peat soils, peat monoliths from Minnesota, put them in these bins. And you can walk under this facility and you can actually look at the side underneath, at the side of a peatland, which is really cool. So you can look at below it, which you never get to do. You only look at the plants, but to actually look at the roots is, to me, is still pretty cool. But anyways, and for this latest treatment, we brought back peat that was drained for like 50 years or something. So it was really dried out peat, and we re-wet half of those. And then we brought in peat that is pristine, that wasn't degraded, and we dried half of that, and the other half we left normal. So we basically restored, we have a restoration treatment. And you can see these are little bins, we can measure everything, and they have. So looking at the flux data that we have over the last 3 years, so the going down is storing more carbon in this graph. So, and here's the degraded site. And once we restored it, it started storing a lot more carbon dioxide, even more than the reference sites. So that's great to see. I was afraid to look at the methane data, but methane didn't go up at all. So again, we're storing more CO2, no methane emissions, or no additional methane emissions. So that's really cool. Right now, our last study on this cover is, we're really going in depth on this question. So there's this big peatland in near Bogota, and you can see it's been drained there's ditches all over the place. Except there's one reference area up here that hasn't been degraded. So what we're doing is we're putting an Eddyflux tower up there that measures carbon dioxide and methane continuously. So we're running that for a year. And then we have another Eddyflux tower in this ditched area. So we'll run them concurrently for a year. Then we're going to restore this area and see how that changes. So that will be really exciting. That'll be the best data yet that we have. But looking at other studies that have done this around the world, peatland restoration does usually increase the amount of CO2 stored with not that much methane emissions increase, but that does vary. Some projects, especially in agricultural fields, can release a lot of nitrous oxide and methane. So sometimes they restore a site and is not as climate friendly as you would like because of those trace greenhouse gases. But I'd say that's rare. Most of the ones that I've looked at, the methane does not increase as much as I think we were worried about. So that's pretty great. But there's a lot of people looking at that question right now. So 350, hey. Boy, I had to go fast. I gotta cut some out. Oh yeah, I just put this last one in just to show this paper just came out, and they were in the Pecosins down in North Carolina area. So they did the same thing. They measured carbon fluxes and methane and nitrous oxide in this peatland down here, and they found the exact same thing I just showed you. That once you restore the site, you get this huge carbon benefit. You increase CO2 storage, and you do not have extra methane and nitrous. I mean, you do, but it wasn't enough to counteract all the CO2 that was sequestering. So I think the AI was right. We should be restoring more peatlands and helping out our atmosphere. So there you go. And there's a summary, just basically what I just said. Peatlands store a lot of carbon, carbon's lost due to degradation, but we can reverse the frustration. But with that, there's literally hundreds of people, if not thousands, of working on all those projects, from scientists to volunteers. So it's definitely being a big team effort.
Well, thank you very much, Rod. Please.
Yep.
Seminar time is officially done, so those of you who leave, please feel free, but I think Bob, you wanted to stick around for a few minutes and answer some questions.
Doesn't look like my plane's leaving anyway, so. No,
So why aren't they emitting methane? And do you think that's just a temporary regrowth of vegetative biomass and that over time it'll?
I don't know. I think you should ask the guy next to you. What do you think? Why is methane not increasing on the restored sites like 2000? Seems like it's substrate quality or the redox.
Substrate quality or impact to competition? Other stuff that we don't-
Redox pumping.
There's some redox storage short term. That's not simple. What's great.
But we see this with fluctuating, with peatlands that have fluctuating water table. You've seen that for a long time, that they often have less methane than those that are stable. So I think it's just the wetting drying cycle changes the peat and the microbial communities. And
Definitely, you have a lot less. It's a lot more aromatic, but less.
I think that's the next question, though. We could really nail that down, because
Surprised that we see some places that have some surface in that. Thought it might be the source, but maybe the surface is just oxidized.
where we see the most methane and restoration is when they make it a little bit too wet and you get cattails in. Those are known as hot spots of methane, and that's a pretty good pattern. So if you see cattails or other big emergents, they usually always have higher methane. And some of those ditches that are blocked and they become a pool, those also can be hot spots for methane. But there are usually hot spots of methane before you restore it too. So
This is just kind of a follow-up. Are the soils pretty acidic, or what is the pH?
it runs from acidic to super high pH, depending on the site.
So I was wondering if that might affect the ability. But another comment, I don't know how important this might be, especially if you've got plants with
Parenchyma.
parenchyma. So you might get anatrophic activity. So you might be getting some methane that you don't expect.
Yeah, but even the ones that were the plant communities didn't change. Still not going up. So. Yeah, it is. There's definitely a lot of work to be done on that. Because I think going into this, everyone said, oh, you're just gonna increase more methane. And so what's the point? I'm thinking maybe that might not be quite as true as we thought.
It's also pretty cool.
Oh, thanks.
I'm having checked over these. Beavers interact with teeth.
They do. I've had beavers help me. We had a wetland to restore near Newberry, and I was supposed to fix all these little ditches. Came back and the beavers had already done it for us. I was like, check that off my list. And yeah, people are using beavers now in restoration actively. So they'll like bring them food to get them started and plant trees for them to eat later. So they build the dams to stop those areas. Yes, but they can also cause problems. They can build at the roads that you're trying to fix, or the culverts, and they can flood your wetlands. And so they're just busy little beavers. A lot more beavers. Yeah, a lot of the wetlands, especially in the floodplain areas, are all beaver created. Not much. Up here in the headwaters, you can have, peat areas. But most of the lower systems along rivers are not. Rivers erode peat. So usually they don't. You can have peats on the side, like you can have peatlands coming down at the edge of the valley, but usually the middle is mineral.
But on your map was the global study of peatlands. There were kind of these bands. Are there any commonalities there, the conditions that are leading to the peat formation? Because it seems very, very.
It's moisture.
It's just all about moisture.
Yeah, peatlands form when you have constant moisture at the site, so it doesn't really dry out, because once it dries out, you introduce oxygen and the process builds up, speeds up. So in the north, you have a short growing season, snow melt, and there rains in the summer, then so things stay wet. In the tropics, you get constant rainfall that keeps it wet. And then those like coarse latitudes, you have the high pressure and they get dry. So that's like the Sahara deserts, so they have very few of them there. But you can get them in the Death Valley, Colorado. I mean, California has peatlands in it. You just have to have a water source coming from a long ways away. And so like oasis in the Sierras or in the Sahara, right? There's little peatlands on the edge. So you can have them anywhere, but you need a special hydrologic situation to create them. Where it is wet, they can form anywhere. Like on the side of a mountain or side of a volcano in Ecuador is all peat. Ricardo.
So my question is, and so I think that the key factor there is that their hands. Yeah. So how complex is this situation there? Like how so yeah.
I'd say they're
like how do you say like now?
Well, I would say every restoration project has to involve the landowner and the stakeholders involved. And it can be the more people who live near them, the more involvement you need. So when I work in Colorado, the peatlands are often out in the wilderness areas, and I just have to work whoever owns it, like the Forest Service or BLM. So there's not a lot of community involvement. But other areas like Indonesia or South America, you have to have all the community involvement. Because originally when they started working in Indonesia, they would come in, like Norway spent $500 million, gave it them, like restore this area, and they didn't involve any of the community members. And all those projects failed. And then, but the Cadogan project actually worked hard. So they hire lots of people to work for them to keep their peatlands safe. So that way those same people aren't there destroying their stuff. So they had to work with the local people. It's the only way it works. So, but as a scientist going to other people's countries, I do not get involved at that. I try to teach them how to restore it, and then they work with the community members and make it happen. So community members will probably never know I was ever there. If I do my job right. Because, yeah, why would they listen to me? So I try to teach the people who do it, and then they work in the country. I think that works better.
What do you think the implications are in Indonesia where you're deliberately trying to get agriculture, food culture? What are the implications for biodiversity?
I think it's better than what it would be otherwise. There's some studies done on other like palm oil plantations. That we actually had projects here where they looked at bird and palm oil plantation stuff. But if you have agroforestry, you can have birds and animals using those, but it wouldn't be as same as if it was a natural forest. So I'd say it'd be a compromise. This is why you wouldn't want the whole thing that way. So you'd have to be strategic where you put those. Deb, you know the answer to that one. It's tough.
Well, thanks again, Rob. That was
Yeah.
really Thanks a lot. Really good.
Good.
Looks like, yeah,
So now you know what I do. Never on the road with some wetlands.
Wow, you get in trouble a lot. That's amazing. When you do those restorations, like goes out for these canal channels and stuff, do you have to reseed or does it naturally reseed?
It depends.
Yeah.
A lot of times we'll take the plants there, we'll break them apart and reclamp them
Oh,
and let them re-spread. Or we buy seed. Usually we don't just wait for them. A lot of those plants don't make a seed bank. So,
Yeah.
you tend to plant it so much.
Yeah. And yeah, so you mostly have to, you don't have like a, yeah, and then you don't have your natural seed bank and you don't have a seed bank someplace else.
So some wetland like marshes, you can do that with, because they're really known for building seed banks. So marsh, sprout, but a lot of these peatlands, they don't. Long lived perennial plants. They don't. And there's no catalog, not like a, oh, I want this plant and that plant, so that gets complicated, like, well, how do we get these plants? That we want in the system, and there's no market.
Yeah, it's different like prairies. You can buy-
Prairies, you can buy that, and some wetlands buy stuff, but a lot of these plants. So we have to figure out, so we did the hard way.
Yeah.
I'm gonna try to get a run for another meeting. Just wanted to say thanks.
Oh,
That was
yeah, yeah.
really great. That
Oh,
was
thank you.
really comprehensive.
Good,
Thanks.
yeah, it's fun to put together.
Pretty impressive.
Yeah, you know, your question is so spot on about why the methane. You see the patterns all the time, but I think mechanism really needs to work out, because there is a lot of confusion in nature. But when I started looking at all the studies that actually measured it, like, it looked like as bad as I was led to believe.
Yeah. And have
And then
some.
we're gonna get a
studies-
lot more, because now we're getting really fast methane sensors. So it used to be really hard to get methane, but now like we have these backpacks and you can get a methane in 30 seconds. You know, as a laser system. So now we can get methane so much. It used to be you collect them in a vial and you bring it back to the lab. And a month later, you might get a sample. And so no, you didn't do it that much, but now there's more excuses.
And some of them have been studied long enough that it looks stable in situations.
Yeah, there's some long-term restoration sites that will come with that. I'd say there's no summary yet, thank you, Jennifer. So I think it'll be coming. But a lot of studies also, they look at it later and they compare it to the reference site and say, oh, it's not quite as good as a reference site, but I think that's the wrong question, because they don't look at it compared to what it was. Right? So if you look at it from what it was, it's always over here. Whether it's as good as the natural site, I don't know. You know, that's a hard ask. But I can tell you, if you have a degraded peatland and you restore it, how much better? Not sure. It probably varies on how well I'm trying to do. But it's definitely worthwhile better.
Okay.
I mean, just not only for carbon, but just all the other.
I enjoyed your talk. Thanks.
Oh, thank you.
Okay. I wonder if Jason, he's a new faculty member in our, he does remote sensing.
Oh, nice.
He's looking for collaborators on campus, and I know there's a lot of folks in Forest. I don't know if you've done any remote sensing.
Oh, we got a ton of work we're doing, but we're working on with Mitri.
Oh, okay.
So GRI, so they are the wetland mappers. I work with Laura Chavez. And they just map, so they're mapping Colombia and
Okay, yeah.
Ecuador forest, and they map wetlands all over the place. Yeah, and we do have good colleagues in our building, so
All right, yeah.
yeah, you should definitely come up and meet them. We have a whole remote sensing.
Oh, yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah.
Have you met any of the other people up in forestry yet, or?
Yeah, I met one guy, he's
Oh.
from Florida. He's from Florida. I forgot his name.
Mickey? No, not Mickey. There's Mickey, Mike, and Kyle.
Paul, yeah, that's a Paul, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay,
And he's kind of new faculty for us too.
right.
Well, he came in during COVID, so he's like still new, because we
Yeah.
didn't know he was there for like 2 years.
Okay.
Have you met any of the three people yet, or Colin Brooks? or-
Yeah, I met, Tom Brooks, yeah, right.
Well, it sounds like there's. Positive interactions.
Yeah, there definitely is.
So I saw that, you used the Lancet for detection of.
Yeah, they use Landsat under radar. In fact, if you talk to the kid with the hat on, he's actually mapping our north.
All right.
He's holding all the mapping.
All right.
So yeah, he'll tell you all about it. Yeah, I don't do the remote sensing myself. I just use their information and we help each other out.
So, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Is that a public